There's a sound that space stations make when they think no one is listening. It's not the hum of the reactors, though that's always there, a low, bone-deep vibration that you stop noticing after the first week. It's not the ventilation cycling through the corridors, or the clang of loading bays, or the multilingual chatter of 600 species going about their business in the common decks. No, the sound I'm talking about is older than any of that. It's the sound of something enormous holding its breath. I noticed it on my third day, aboard way station Vraith-9. Most people don't notice sounds like that. Most people, and I use the word loosely, because maybe 40% of this station's population would qualify as people by the old Earth definition, are too busy making their own noise to hear what the station is doing underneath. But I was always the type who noticed the underneath things. My bunkmates at the academy called it a problem. My evaluation officer called it a liability. I called it the only reason I was still alive. My name is Dalen Reyes. I was 23 years old when I got posted to Vraith-9 as part of the Galactic Coalition's Human Integration Initiative, a program that, on paper, existed to embed human recruits in multi-species military environments to foster cooperation and understanding. In practice, it existed because the Galactic Coalition's senior members had run out of polite ways to tell humanity to stop applying for membership, and someone in the diplomatic corps had figured out that letting humans embarrass themselves in real military environments was cheaper than explaining, for the 15th time, why our application was denied. That's the version my academy friend Priya told me before I shipped out. She had a gift for cutting through institutional language and finding the ugly little truth underneath. She was right as usual. Vraith-9 was a Tier 3 way station, which meant it was large enough to have its own gravity wells, its own agriculture bays, its own legal system, and its own politics. It sat at the junction of 3 major transit corridors, which made it strategically important to 4 different coalition members, and spiritually important to at least 2 species whose religious observance I never fully understood. It processed roughly 6,000 transit ships a month. It had a standing military garrison of around 800 soldiers from 9 different species. And as of the 4th morning of my posting, it had 1 human. Me. The others from my intake cohort had been distributed to different stations. Way Station Command had apparently decided that clustering humans together defeated the purpose of the integration initiative. Or possibly they just done it alphabetically, and my last name ended up here. Either way, I was alone, and I knew it, and the 400 soldiers currently eating breakfast in the garrison mess hall knew it too. I carried my tray to an empty table in the back corner, not the farthest table that would look like hiding, just far enough that I had my back to the wall and a clear line of sight to the exits and to every occupied table between me and the door. The mess hall smelled like 17 kinds of food preparation that I couldn't identify, and one kind I could something close to scrambled eggs, though I suspected the resemblance was chemical rather than biological. I ate quietly. The first thing I'd learned at Vraith-9 was that quiet was different in a multi-species environment. Human quiet was just the absence of talking. The Velhari troops in the 4th row were quiet too, but their silence was communicative. The angle of their secondary limbs, the rhythm of their mandible clicks, the precise way they had positioned themselves relative to the door, all said things to each other that words would have been redundant to express. The Oryx soldiers near the window were quiet in a different way, a deliberate, watchful stillness that their physiology used for threat assessment. Even silence had an accent here. I was learning to read it. What I was reading, at that particular breakfast, while pretending to be very interested in my possibly egg substance, was this. A group of 5 Garen soldiers at the table closest to the main entrance had been having a conversation that involved me. Not about me, about me. The direction of their visual organs, the tilt of their cranial ridges, the specific cadence of their whispered exchanges. I'd read about Garen in the Academy cultural briefings. Communal pack species, highly status conscious, known for testing new arrivals through a sequence of escalating social provocations designed to establish hierarchy. The briefings had described this as a culturally significant bonding ritual and advised human recruits to respond with cultural sensitivity and patience. I'd read between the lines enough to know that culturally significant bonding ritual was coalition diplomatic language for they will bother you until you either break or pass. The question was what form the bothering would take. I put my fork down and adjusted my posture very slightly, straightening my back, angling my shoulders open, the small physical signals that said I was aware of my surroundings without being visibly reactive. It was a technique I'd developed young, in a childhood environment that had also involved a lot of hierarchy testing. Some lessons carry. One of the Garen, large, scarred across the right side of his facial plates, wearing the insignia of a Tier 2 weapons specialist, pushed back from his table and walked toward mine. He stopped 3 feet away, stood there, said nothing. I looked up from my breakfast, met what I estimated were his primary visual organs, and held eye contact for a count of 2. Then I looked back at my food, not a flinch, not a challenge. Just acknowledgement and return. In human terms, that sequence says, I see you. I'm not afraid of you. I'm also not looking for trouble. Whether the Garen read it the same way, I didn't know. But he stood there for another 5 seconds, I counted, and then he walked away. I finished my breakfast. His name, I found out later, was Vraith-Hounds, First Sergeant, 12 years of service, veteran of 3 active conflict deployments. He was considered something of an authority figure among the Garen contingent, which numbered about 60 soldiers in the garrison. His assessment of a new arrival, any new arrival, was watched closely by those 60 soldiers and carried genuine social weight. I found this out from the only person who voluntarily sat down next to me in the mess hall during my first 2 weeks. A Velhari signals tech named Vraith-Hounds, who had an academic interest in human social behavior and communicated primarily through a translation device worn on her primary limb joint. She was approximately the height of a large dog, covered in pale sensory filaments, and had the personality of someone who had read every field guide ever written about you and was desperately curious to see if any of it was accurate. Vraith-Hounds assessed you this morning, she told me on day 5, sitting across from me in a posture I'd learned meant conversational rather than observational. The other Garen are discussing it. What's the discussion? She tilted slightly, the Velhari equivalent of a considering pause. The word they are using does not translate cleanly. Closest approximation is uncertain, or possibly wait and see. That seems reasonable. For Garen, uncertain is a significant status. Most new arrivals receive a cleaner initial assessment. You are the first human they have encountered in a garrison context. They do not know how you map onto their hierarchy. And that bothers them. Another tilt. It does not bother them, it interests them, which is almost the same thing in Garen terms. I thought about that, so they're going to keep testing. Yes. Good, I said. Vraith-Hounds' filaments rippled in a pattern I hadn't yet learned to read. You find this good. I find it honest. I know what they're doing and why. That's better than the alternatives. She was quiet for a moment. Her translation device clicked softly as she formulated something. What are the alternatives? People who decide what you are before they've tested anything, I said. Those are harder to manage. The Garen weren't the only ones watching. Vraith-9 garrison had a complex internal ecology. 800 soldiers from 9 species living and working in the same pressurized environment developed social structures that were partly institutional, rank, unit, posting, and partly organic. The kind of layered alliances and rivalries and understandings that grow naturally when any group of intelligent creatures is confined together long enough. Humans weren't part of that ecology. Officially, we were guests. Technically, we were recruits in a mutual exchange program. Practically, we were unknowns, and unknowns in a garrison environment make everyone uncomfortable, because in a garrison environment, unknowns have a habit of becoming problems. My direct commanding officer was a Kelthran named Commander Vraith-Hounds. The Kelthran were a tall, gray-skinned species with 4 eyes, 2 primary, 2 secondary set slightly further back on the skull, giving them close to 300 degrees of visual coverage, and a communication style that involved as few words as possible. Vraith-Hounds had received me in her office on day 1, with the expression of someone opening a package they hadn't ordered. "Raise," she said, looking at my file on her screen without looking at me. "Human, first posting." "Yes, Commander." "You've been assigned to Perimeter Security Team 7, 12-hour rotations. Your partner is Jas Corin, a Thurath soldier with 8 years of experience. You will follow his lead. You will not take independent action. You will flag all observations to Jas Corin for assessment before acting on them." "Understood, Commander." She looked at me then, all 4 eyes, which was slightly unnerving if you weren't used to it. I held still. "The integration initiative says I should give you opportunities to demonstrate your capabilities. I will do that, but I want to be clear about what I expect." "What's that, Commander?" "I expect you to be competent, quiet, and unproblematic for the duration of your posting. The garrison has enough complexity without adding a human variable." "Yes, Commander." She nodded, looked back at her screen, and that was the end of our first conversation. Jas Corin was a Thurath, stocky, golden-scaled, built like someone had taken the concept of reliable and made it into a species. He had a wife and 3 children back on the Thurath home colony, photographs of whom were pinned to the interior of his locker in the Security Team 7 ready room, and he had an opinion about everything, which he shared whether or not anyone had asked. He was also, despite my instructions to follow his lead and not act independently, genuinely pleased to have a partner who listened. "The problem with Velhari partners," he told me on our 3rd rotation together, walking the outer ring of Corridor Section D, "is that they observe everything and tell you nothing. You are walking with someone who has just noticed 12 suspicious things and is deciding which 3 are worth mentioning." "And Garen partners?" "Garen partners tell you everything immediately, whether or not it is important, and then become irritable if you do not respond correctly. Auric partners are excellent, but they walk too fast and will not slow down because you have shorter legs." "What about Kelthran?" Jas Corin made the Thurath sound that I'd learned meant something between a laugh and a grunt. "Kelthran partners communicate in grunts and expect you to develop psychic abilities. Vossaren grunts are a language. I have been here 4 years, and I can read maybe 30% of them." "What are the remaining 70%? "Probably disapproval of various things I have done." I smiled. "And human partners?" He gave me a sideways look. "I have not had enough data points to assess." A pause. "You are quieter than I expected." "What were you expecting?" "The briefing files on humans describe you as social, high energy, verbally communicative, and prone to emotional displays. Those are accurate descriptions of humans in general. They're not accurate descriptions of me specifically." He considered this. "You are an outlier. Or the briefing files are averaging a large sample down to a set of traits that describe everyone weakly and nobody precisely." Another pause. "That," he said slowly, "is also true of the briefing files on Thurath." "What do they say about you?" "That we are methodical, tradition-oriented, slow to adapt, and prone to excessive caution." He paused. "The slow to adapt part is particularly insulting. I speak 6 languages." 7, I said. He stopped walking. What? You've been using Garen phrases when you talk about Vraith-Hounds unit. The ones that don't have direct coalition standard equivalents. That's not something you pick up from a language module. That's something you learn from spending time around the speakers. I'd call that 7 languages, at least functionally. Jaskorin stared at me for a moment with his golden eyes. Then he made the laugh grunt sound again, louder this time. Quiet, he said, but not unobservant. No, I said, not unobservant. The shift came on day 19. I know exactly when it was because I still have my rotation log from that period, and I've looked at it enough times to have the numbers memorized. Day 19 of my posting. Rotation 14. We were 2 hours into a 12-hour perimeter shift on the outer ring when Jaskorin received a priority comm from the ready room and had to leave to deal with it. He was apologetic about it. Internal logistics issue. The new cargo manifests from the last transit wave have a discrepancy that Vossaren wants addressed by someone who can read Oryx shipping documentation. That is apparently me. I can finish the ring check solo, I said. I know you can. Standard protocol applies. You complete the check. You flag anything unusual through the comm unit. You don't engage independently. He gave me a look that was somehow both trusting and cautious at the same time. Do not engage independently. Understood. He left. I continued along the outer ring. The outer ring of Corridor Section D was one of the quieter parts of the station. It connected the secondary cargo bays to the transit docking arms and was mostly used by maintenance crews and automated freight systems. At 14:00 station time, there was almost no foot traffic. The lights in this section ran at 70% because the photoreceptor range of the Oryx maintenance crews preferred lower intensity, and the result was a corridor that felt more like a tunnel, long, faintly humming, lit by strips of amber light that caught the metal of the walls and made them look like they were made of old amber themselves. I was 3/4 of the way through the ring check when I found the compartment. It wasn't supposed to be there. I mean, the compartment itself was supposed to be there. It was on the manifest as Cargo Hold 7C, a secondary storage space for transit equipment. But the door was open, and Cargo Hold 7C was supposed to be locked and empty. I stopped, listened. There were voices inside. 3, maybe 4. It was hard to tell because they were speaking in a mix of coalition standard and what I recognized as Garen, and they were speaking quietly. Deliberately quietly, the way you speak when you know you're somewhere you shouldn't be and you're trying not to attract attention. I flagged the compartment on my comm unit, marked it as requiring investigation, and prepared to call it in to Jaskorin. Then I heard what they were actually saying. My coalition standard was better than it had any right to be, because I'd spent the year before my posting obsessively studying it on the logic that if I was going to be the only human in a multi-species garrison, I should be able to understand everything happening around me. And my Garen was limited but not non-existent. I'd been listening to 60 Garen soldiers for 19 days, and the phrases that came up repeatedly tend to stick. What I heard in rough translation was this. The shipment arrives on the next transit wave. Corridor 7 is the transfer point. The window is 30 minutes. What about the patrol schedule? Adjusted. The human is solo on the outer ring for the next 2 hours. It won't flag anything. A pause, then. The human doesn't know what to look for. Laughter, not nice laughter. Even if it did, who would listen to it? I stood very still in the corridor for approximately 4 seconds. Then I did 3 things in this order. First, I took a step back from the doorway so that if anyone inside looked up, they wouldn't see me. Second, I activated my comm unit on a narrowband frequency that Jaskorin had showed me on day 2. The frequency that bypassed the main garrison channel and connected directly to a priority security line, used for sensitive situations where you didn't want your transmission monitored by everyone on the standard channel. Third, very quietly, I said, Jaskoran, cargo hold 7C unauthorized persons, possible contraband transfer. They reference the patrol schedule and the transit wave window. I'm not engaging. Standing by. Then I put my comm unit on receive, moved to a position 2 meters back from the doorway in the shadow of a freight stack, and waited. It took Jaskoran 6 minutes to get back to me. In those 6 minutes, I counted the voices, 4, I was now sure, tracked the pattern of their movements inside the compartment based on the sounds, and learned 3 additional facts. The transfer involved at least one of the corridor access codes that only garrison security staff were supposed to have. The shipment was biological in some unspecified way that made 2 of the 4 voices sound careful and slightly nervous, and one of the voices belonged to someone who had used a Garen rank address form that placed them at least at the level of a senior NCO. When Jaskoran's voice came back through the narrowband, it was very controlled. Raise, stay where you are. Vraith-Hounds is being notified. 2-person response team is mobilizing. Do not engage and do not let them know you are there. Understood, I said. How did you know to flag this? The door was open. It's on the manifest as locked and empty. A pause. You memorized the cargo manifest. I read it on shift prep this morning. I read all the documentation I'm given. Another pause longer. Stay in position. Response team ETA 8 minutes. I stayed in position. The response team arrived in 7.5. The 4 individuals inside the compartment were taken into custody. The shipment, which turned out to be a crate of restricted bioactive compounds being moved through the station to avoid coalition customs inspection, was confiscated. Vraith-Hounds debriefed me personally that evening. She asked me to walk her through my actions, decision by decision, and I did. She listened with all 4 eyes forward, the attentive configuration I'd learned, and didn't interrupt. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. You followed protocol, she said. Yes, Commander. You used the narrowband frequency correctly. Jaskoran showed me how on day 2. He said knowing the right channel was more important than knowing what to say. She looked at me for a long moment. And you read the cargo manifest? Yes, Commander. On your own initiative. Because you thought it would be useful. I thought it was the kind of thing I should know if I was patrolling the section. Vraith-Hounds made a sound. It wasn't the disapproval grunt. I didn't have a word for it yet. Dismissed, raise. I was almost at the door when she spoke again. Raise. Commander. The individuals in the compartment. One of them mentioned the patrol schedule. Yes, Commander. They said it had been adjusted to ensure the human would be alone on the outer ring during the transfer window. Yes, Commander. Her 4 eyes all focused on me at once, which I still wasn't used to. Someone in this garrison gave them that information. Yes, I said, I know. She held my gaze. What does that tell you? That someone in this garrison has a problem with having a human here, and that they were willing to use me as a gap in coverage, because they assumed I wouldn't notice what was happening through that gap. Another long pause. Yes, said Vraith-Hounds, in a tone I hadn't heard from her before. That is exactly what it tells us. Part 2. The shape of the problem. The investigation took 3 days. I wasn't part of it. That wasn't my role. And Vraith-Hounds was careful to keep Security Team 7's junior human recruit away from anything that could compromise the chain of evidence or generate complications in the proceedings. I understood that and didn't push. What I did do was continue my rotations with Jaskoran, and continue being quiet and unproblematic and observant, which had apparently become my primary distinguishing characteristic in the garrison's assessment of me. On the second day of the investigation, something changed in the mess hall. It was subtle. The Garen contingent, which had maintained its wait-and-see posture toward me since Vraith-Hounds' initial assessment, shifted. I noticed it first in the way their table orientations changed. Less of the group clustered toward the entrance, more of them positioned with clear sightlines to where I usually sat. Their conversations in my vicinity went quiet rather than continuing, which was the opposite of the aggressive ignoring behavior I'd been receiving previously. Vraith-Hounds explained it when she sat down next to me on day 2 of the investigation. The Garen are talking about you. Still uncertain. No, something has changed. Her filaments moved in a pattern I'd learned to associate with careful consideration. The word they are using now does not translate easily either. The best approximation is watched, but with a positive valence, more like seen. Seen, I repeated. Among Garen, to be watched or seen means that others have recognized that you are worthy of attention. It is not approval exactly. It is recognition, a prerequisite for anything further. I thought about that, because of what happened in Corridor D. Because of how you handled it, you were alone. You could have panicked or alerted them directly or failed to notice entirely. Instead, you observed, recognized, and responded correctly. She paused. And you did not try to make yourself larger than the situation. That is specifically something Garen assess. The ones who puff themselves up after a success, those are dismissed as status chasers. You went back to your bunk, apparently, and slept. I was tired. Yes, that is the point. The investigation concluded on day 3, with the arrest of a Garen supply sergeant named Ketasavar on charges of selling garrison patrol information to a contraband network operating through the transit corridor system. He was facing transfer to coalition military prosecution, which was not a comfortable outcome by any species standards. The interesting part was what Vraith-Hounds did when the arrest was announced. I wasn't present for it. I heard about it from 3 separate sources, Jaskorin, Vraith-Hounds, and a Kelthrin communications specialist named Drevath, who had apparently decided I was interesting enough to talk to since I appeared to have a habit of being near things when they happened. What Asen did was this. He walked to the center of the mess hall during the communal evening meal, all 800 garrison members present, and he made a formal Garen declaration of what Vraith-Hounds later translated for me as acknowledgement of external merit. It was a cultural form used when someone outside your pack had done something that deserved recognition, particularly when that something had benefited your pack by removing a compromised element. Then he looked at me directly, across the hall, holding that contact for 3 full seconds, which in Garen terms I was told was quite long, and inclined his head. Just that, one deliberate incline of the head. The mess hall was very quiet for a moment. Then conversation resumed and dinner continued, and nobody made a speech or held a ceremony. But something had happened in that room. I could feel it in the way the temperature of the space had changed, not physically, but socially, the way you can feel a change in atmospheric pressure before a storm even if you can't see the sky. What does that mean? I asked Jaskorin afterward quietly, walking back to the security team's 7-ready room. He was quiet for a moment, which with Jaskorin usually meant he was choosing his words. It means, he said finally, that Vraith-Hounds has decided you are a person. I'm a person, regardless of whether he decides that. Yes, Jaskorin said, in a tone that was both agreeing and not exactly agreeing. But in this garrison, in this environment, his deciding it has consequences. There are 60 Garen soldiers here who defer to his assessments. You were before an unknown quantity. You are now a person. That is not nothing. I thought about it. What does it change practically? Very little immediately. Over time, possibly quite a lot. He gave me one of his golden-eyed sideways looks. It depends on what happens next. And what happens next? He made the laugh-grunt sound. With humans, apparently, you never know. What happened next in the short term was that I continued my rotations and continued being competent and quiet, and continued reading every document I was given. I also started learning Garen more systematically, not the common room phrases I'd been accumulating passively, but the structure of it, the way meaning was built through the combination of tone register and limb position, that the translation devices always flattened into approximate equivalents. Sethara Ulketh helped me with Velhari in exchange, which was a fair trade. We developed an odd routine of eating dinner together twice a week and quizzing each other on cultural misreadings and translation errors, which I found useful, and she found apparently fascinating in a way she couldn't entirely explain. "You learn languages," she observed one evening, "in a way that is different from what the briefing files describe." What do the briefing files say? That humans learn languages through exposure and imitation, with strong reliance on emotional association and social reinforcement. That you require encouragement and positive feedback to sustain motivation. "That's true for some humans," I said. "You learn through pattern analysis," she said, tilting in the considering pause way. "You find the underlying structure and then fit the individual instances into it, like reverse engineering a system." I grew up in an environment where reading the pattern was more important than reading the individual. She was quiet. Her filaments moved in a new configuration I hadn't seen before. "That sounds lonely." I hadn't expected that response. I sat with it for a moment. It was, sometimes, but it made me good at noticing things. "Yes," she said, "it did." On day 31, I met the Vraith-Hounds. I say met. That's not quite the right word. What actually happened was that I was doing a solo patrol of the outer ring. Jaskoran was attending a unit briefing. I turned a corner in corridor section C, and I nearly walked into two of them. The Vraith-Hounds were not a species in the way the Coalition used the term. They were the closest equivalent I've been able to construct from the fragments of documentation available, because there wasn't much documentation, because the Coalition didn't talk about them much, something between a designation and a category. Biological entities, definitely. Intelligent, by any measure that intelligence had ever been defined, but not part of the Coalition, not allied with the Coalition, not enemies of the Coalition. They existed in a relationship with the galactic civilization that nobody had entirely figured out how to categorize, so the category that had been settled on was autonomous tactical observers with historic agreements. What they looked like? Large. Not enormous, but large. The two I nearly collided with stood at approximately 7 feet at the shoulder, shaped something like a wolf, but the way a wolf would be shaped if wolves had been designed by something that had studied the concept of wolf and then made deliberate improvements. They moved on 6 limbs, 4 of which touched the ground. The other 2 were folded against the torso in a configuration that read as compact rather than vestigial. They could extend them. I would learn. And when they did, it was usually significant. Their coloring was wrong. Not wrong in a way that was unpleasant to look at, but wrong in the sense that your visual system kept trying to resolve it into something familiar and couldn't quite. A dark that wasn't quite black. A shimmer that wasn't quite silver. Like looking at deep water from above and not being able to tell how far down it went. Their eyes were amber. Not glowing, not threatening, just very clearly, very specifically amber. The color of old glass. The color of something that had seen a great deal and retained it. I stopped walking. They stopped walking. We looked at each other. My heart rate did something complicated that I mostly managed to keep off my face. My training kicked in through a 2-second gap of pure instinct freeze, and I put myself in a neutral stance, weight centered. Hands visible at my sides, nothing that read as threat or submission or panic. One of them, slightly larger, the way the lead is usually slightly larger in any pack-organized species, tilted its head. It was a very specific tilt, the kind of tilt that says I am assessing you and you are not immediately categorized. I held still. The other one made a sound. Low. Not a vocalization exactly, more like the feeling of a vocalization, something that bypassed my ears a little and registered in the middle of my chest. Then the first one, the larger one, did something I hadn't expected. It continued walking, past me, as if I was furniture. The second one followed. I turned and watched them go. They moved like water downstairs, too smooth, too purposeful, the product of a physics that worked the same as everyone else's but had been optimized past the point where the optimization showed. At the end of the corridor, the larger one glanced back, not at me specifically, just a trailing check of the environment it was leaving. But our eyes met for about a second, and in that second something was communicated that I didn't have words for. Then they turned the corner and were gone. I stood in the corridor for a long time after that, just listening to the station breathe. I asked Jaskorin about the Vraith-Hounds that evening. He got quiet in the specific way Thurath got quiet when you'd asked about something that made them uncomfortable but that they weren't going to refuse to discuss. They're stationed here, have been for about a year. Vossaren doesn't talk about why. What do the garrison members say about them? They don't, or they say as little as possible. He paused. They make people uncomfortable. Not in a threatening way, they haven't harmed anyone, they don't interfere with garrison operations. They just exist in a way that makes you aware of being looked at. Where do they stay? Section H, the outer section. They requested a space with access to the exterior observation decks. He paused again. They go out there. At night cycle. Nobody knows what they're doing. Some people think they're communicating with something, but the signals team has never picked up anything. How many are there? 3. Sometimes I think there are more, but nobody has counted above 3. He said this in a matter-of-fact way that was somehow more unsettling than if he'd said it with emphasis. Dahlan. It was the first time he'd used my first name. I paid attention. The Vraith-Hounds have historic agreements with the coalition that nobody in this garrison has full access to. What they are doing here, what they are looking at, who or what they are reporting to, nobody knows. Most people find it easier to pretend they don't exist. He looked at me. I am telling you this so that you understand. The thing you are doing, trying to learn about them, trying to categorize them, that is a human instinct that you should probably let go of. Because I won't be able to. Because you will, partially. And partial understanding of the Vraith-Hounds is possibly more dangerous than no understanding at all. I thought about that for a while. I already met 2 of them, I said. He stared at me. You what? In corridor C this afternoon. We looked at each other for a while and then they left. A very long pause, and nothing. They walked past me. One of them looked back when they turned the corner. Jaskorin was silent for a moment. That, he said carefully, does not happen. People avoid the Vraith-Hounds. The Vraith-Hounds walk corridors that are empty when they walk them. You do not simply encounter them. I did. He looked at me for a long time with his golden eyes. You, he said finally slowly, are a strange human, Dahlan Rays. You're not the first person to observe that. Part 3. What they were building. The problem with being recognized was that it made you visible. And being visible meant that not everyone who noticed you was going to be pleased about it. I understood this abstractly before I understood it concretely. The concrete version arrived on day 38, in the form of 3 Auric soldiers and a utility corridor. The Auric were one of the coalition's founding species, long-limbed, pale carapaced, with a history stretching back far enough that most of their cultural reference points had no equivalent in any other civilization's experience. They were respected, influential, and quietly resentful of the integration initiative in a way that expressed itself in formal politeness and careful exclusion, rather than anything that could be easily documented. The specific 3 Auric who found me in the utility corridor adjacent to Section G were not acting on behalf of their species. They were acting on behalf of themselves, 3 soldiers who had apparently decided, for their own reasons, that the human recruit's increasing visibility in the garrison was a problem that required direct correction. I was alone because it was the transition window between rotations. I'd signed off on one shift and was heading back to quarters before the next. The utility corridor was a shortcut I'd started using because it cut 6 minutes off the walk. I'd been taking it for 2 weeks, which meant anyone paying attention would know I'd be there, alone, at exactly this time. I noticed the problem about 30 seconds before it materialized. The corridor had a sound profile I'd cataloged over 2 weeks of regular use, and the sound profile was wrong. 2 breathing patterns behind me that were moving with deliberate speed, and one ahead, positioned near the corner. 3-point intercept. It was textbook, which told me it had been planned, which told me this was not spontaneous. I thought about Jaskorin's voice. Do not engage independently. I thought about Vosserin's 4 eyes. Do not be unproblematic was not what she'd said exactly. She'd said be competent, quiet, and unproblematic. Those 3 things didn't have to be mutually exclusive. I stopped walking, turned around. The 2 behind me stopped too. They'd expected me to keep walking into the 3rd at the corner. The change in plan registered on their faces as surprise, which is a useful window surprise, because it takes most species a half-second to shift from their planned script to improvisation. I used the half-second to take 3 steps back toward the nearest cross corridor and put my back to the wall so that there was no corner behind me that I couldn't see. Then I pulled out my comm unit. Not activating it, just holding it where they could see it. I'm going to give this 2 seconds, I said, in coalition standard clearly, at a volume that was not aggressive but was definitely not quiet. And then I'm going to activate this and call Jaskorin. The one at the corner had come around by now, completing the 3-point. They looked at each other. The comm unit was visible. The narrowband frequency was programmed in. We have nothing to say to you, said one of the 2 behind me, in Auric-accented standard, slightly formal, the tone of someone sticking to a script. That's fine, I said. I have nothing to say to you either. But I'm going to stand here until I reach the cross-corridor intersection, and then I'm going to continue to my quarters, and this is going to be the only moment this interaction exists. Another look between them. Unless it doesn't stay that way, I said, in which case I activate the comm. The one at the corner spoke for the first time. Lower voice, more authority, the one with the most rank, I guessed, based on the deference the other 2 had been giving him. You are making an enemy of people who have been in this garrison for 6 years. I'm making no enemies, I said. I'm walking to my quarters. You think your position protects you. Vraith-Hounds' acknowledgement, Commander Vosserin's attention. Your little human cleverness. I don't think any of that protects me from anything, I said honestly. I think being in a well-lit corridor with a comm unit is a practical measure, not a declaration of war. I'm going to take 3 more steps toward the intersection now. I took 3 steps, they didn't move. You're very calm, said the one with the authority, and something in his voice had shifted from scripted to genuinely curious. For someone in your position. I've been in worse positions, I said, and I've noticed that being calm in them tends to produce better outcomes. I took 3 more steps. I was at the intersection now. We'll see, he said. Yes, I said, we will. I turned and walked to my quarters at a normal pace. My heart rate was elevated. I breathed through it carefully and systematically, the way I'd learned to breathe through things when I was 12 years old, and the corridor in question had been a school hallway, and the 3-point configuration had been significantly less formal. Some lessons, as I said, Carrie. I didn't tell Jaskorin about the corridor, but I did file an incident report, a quiet one, minimal detail, factual rather than interpretive. Just, 3 Oryx soldiers in Utility Section G, apparent planned interception, no contact, no confrontation, logged and time-stamped. Because if anything ever developed further, I wanted the record to show when it had started. 2 days later, Setharul-Keth told me that someone was asking about me in ways that were not standard social curiosity. Asking what specifically, I said. Your rotation schedule, your communication habits, whether you have off-site connections, family, academy contacts, anyone who would notice if you were. She paused, her filaments doing the careful formulation ripple. Removed from visibility. I sat with that for a moment. The mess hall was its usual multilingual mid-morning chaos around us. Who's asking? I don't know, the questions are coming through intermediaries, but the pattern of it, she tilted. It does not feel like Garen curiosity. The Garen questioning about you is positive in valence now. This is different, more careful, more systematic. More like someone building a case. Building a case for what? I don't know yet, I said. But I'm going to find out. She was quiet for a moment. Dahlen, this garrison has more complex politics than the briefing files suggested. Some of what is moving around you, it is not personal. It is larger. What do you mean? Her filaments did something I hadn't seen before, a configuration that felt like bracing. The integration initiative is not popular with everyone. There are coalition members who believe that humans are being integrated not because you are capable, but as a political gesture, to manage humanity's growing independence without formally admitting you to coalition membership. And there are those who believe that if humans fail visibly in a garrison setting, it creates a documented record that can be used to argue against the integration initiative entirely. I looked at her. So some of this isn't about me specifically. No, you are the human at Vraith-9. That makes you the data point. If you succeed, the initiative gains argument. If you fail, or if you can be made to fail, or if evidence can be constructed of failure, the initiative loses argument, I said. And humanity's case for coalition membership becomes significantly harder to make. I thought about that. About the corridor in Section G and the careful, systematic questions, about someone adjusting patrol schedules to put the human alone in coverage gaps, about the particular, deliberate way I was being set up as a failure point. How long has this been going on? I asked. I don't know when it started, she said, but I know that what happened in Cargo Hold 7C was not the test you passed. It was the test that made you visible enough for the real test to begin. Part 4, The Long Night. I spent 3 days thinking about what Setharul-Keth had told me, and what I should do about it. The impulse I kept coming back to and kept rejecting was to take it to Voss-Aaron directly. Not because I didn't trust her. I did trust her, with increasing confidence, as much as I trusted anyone in the garrison. But because if the problem was political and institutional, then the response needed to be institutional too. And if I was the one bringing the concern forward, I needed to be sure I was bringing something concrete enough that it couldn't be dismissed or deflected. What I had was pattern, not evidence. I had changed behaviors and overheard fragments and a Velhari signals text assessment of the social undercurrents. That was not nothing. I believed it was accurate, but it wasn't documentation. So I watched and I waited, and I let the rotation continue. On day 47, 2 things happened on the same day that changed the shape of the problem. The first thing, I was assigned for the first time to a solo night patrol of Section H. This was unusual. Section H was Corridor C's continuation. The outer ring section that included the observation decks where the Vraith-Hounds spent their nights. Solo night patrol of Section H was typically assigned to experienced garrison soldiers, not to a first-posting human recruit 47 days into his posting. The assignment came through the standard rotation system, but when I checked the rotation logs, I saw that the assignment had been manually adjusted by someone with supervisor-level access. The same supervisor-level access that had adjusted the patrol schedule before the cargo hold 7C incident. I noted this and said nothing about it to anyone. The second thing, Vraith-Hounds found me in the corridor outside the ready room 3 hours before the night rotation was scheduled to start. He was alone, which was unusual. Garen almost always traveled in groups of at least 2, not from weakness but from habit, the pack orientation of a species that thought in collective terms. Asin alone meant this was a deliberate choice, a deliberate signal. He stopped in front of me and did not speak immediately. This was Garen. They were comfortable with the weight of silence in a way that humans mostly weren't. I was comfortable with it too, which I think surprised him slightly. "Section H tonight," he said finally. "Yes." "Night cycle solo." "Yes." He looked at me for a moment. His scarred facial plates were neutral in the way that Garen neutral was not the same as human neutral, not an absence of expression, but a deliberate containment of it. "You know why." It wasn't a question. "I have a theory." "Your theory is correct." He paused. "There is a shipment moving tonight, not through Corridor D this time. Through Section H the timing coincides with your solo patrol window." Another pause. "This is not a coincidence." "No," I said. "You were put on that patrol because someone believes you will not notice, or that if you notice, no one will take your report seriously. Because you are human and first posting, and because the incident in Corridor D was documented as a single event rather than a pattern." I looked at him. "You know all of this." "I know the movement in my own pack," he said. "Even the parts I do not approve of. Even the parts that were done by members of my unit before I could stop them." His facial plates shifted slightly, something I'd come to recognize as the Garen equivalent of weight. Ketasavar was selling information. I did not know until it was over. That is on me. I don't hold that against you. I know you don't. That is part of why I am here. He was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do tonight?" Dallin raised. First name like Jaskoran had used it. I paid attention. "I'm going to do my patrol," I said, "and I'm going to notice what I notice. And then I'm going to report correctly through the correct channels, as I am trained to do." His facial plates moved again, in a configuration I hadn't seen before. "They are expecting you to either miss it or to overcorrect, to see a second incident and either fail to report it, or to react emotionally and create documentation that can be used against you." "I know," I said. "They don't know what to do with someone who simply does the correct thing correctly." "I've noticed," I said, "that being predictable is underestimated as a tactic." He looked at me for a long time. Then he inclined his head, that same deliberate incline from the mess hall. "Tonight," he said, "I will be in Section F adjacent. If something develops that requires a corroborating witness, you will have one." I understood what he was offering. "That's not nothing," I said. "No," he said. "It is not." He turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the corridor with the weight of what was coming settling around me like a change in pressure. The night rotation began at 22:00 station time. Section H at night cycle was a different environment than during the day. The lights ran at 40%, barely enough to see clearly, enough to navigate. The observation deck access corridors were lit only by the ambient glow coming through the transparent panels at the end of each arm, the cold blue-black of space pressing against the station's glass like something curious. I walked my patrol at a steady pace, checking each checkpoint, marking each station on my log, doing everything exactly as I was supposed to do. At the second checkpoint, I smelled something. My olfactory senses were not superhuman. They were ordinary human, which meant they were actually quite good by multi-species garrison standards. because most coalition species had developed in environments where vision was the primary sense, and smell was a secondary or tertiary function. Humans, by contrast, came from a planet where the dark had been long and dangerous, and the ability to smell what was coming before you could see it had mattered enough to get written into the genome. What I smelled was a biological preservative compound, something used in the stasis transport of living material. Faint, but identifiable once you knew what you were looking for. I marked my position and continued my patrol without changing pace. At the third checkpoint, I found the access hatch. Not a door, a maintenance hatch in the floor plating, the kind used by engineering teams to access the cable runs and utility conduits beneath the main corridor floor. It had a standard lock. The standard lock had been bypassed with a temporary override code. I crouched down and examined it without touching it. The override code from the diagnostic display on the lock housing had been entered 20 minutes ago, 20 minutes before my patrol began. I straightened up, continued my patrol. At the next checkpoint, I activated my narrowband comm. Jas Corin. He'd been on shift extension tonight, a fact I'd noted as suspicious when the scheduling came through. Rays, he'd been waiting. Section H, Checkpoint 3. Maintenance hatch, floor access to utility conduits, compromised lock, override entry 20 minutes ago. I kept my voice level and factual. Biological preservative odor in the vicinity, strong enough to suggest recent transport. A pause, understood. Vraith-Hounds is being contacted now. There's more. Go ahead. The override code on the lock is logged in the diagnostic display. It's a supervisor-level code, the same access level that adjusted tonight's patrol schedule. A longer pause. Rays, I need you to maintain your patrol. Do not deviate. Vraith-Hounds' response team is mobilizing. Understood. And Rays. Yes. Are you safe? I considered. For now, the operation hasn't been disrupted yet. No one knows I've found it. I paused. I'd like it to stay that way until the response team arrives. Keep the comm open on narrowband. I want to hear your patrol sounds. Understood. I continued my patrol. My footsteps were regular. My breathing was controlled. The station held its enormous breath around me, and I matched it, held and released, held and released. At the fourth checkpoint, two things happened. The first, I heard movement from below the floor plating, near the maintenance hatch I'd found. The sound of something being moved through a conduit, something large enough that its passage transferred vibration upward through the floor. The second, I saw the Vraith-Hounds. There were 3 of them at the end of the observation corridor, not walking, standing, facing me. In the blue-black light of the space panels, they were barely visible, a shape suggesting darkness within darkness, 6 limbs, amber eyes that caught the barest available light and held it. They were very still. Not a still of waiting, not a still of watching, a still of having already decided. I stopped walking. We looked at each other across about 30 meters of corridor. One of them the largest, and I recognized it now as the one I'd seen in Corridor C, the one who had glanced back when they turned the corner, lowered its head slightly. Not a threat display. Something else. Something that my brain translated without the help of any briefing file or cultural documentation as acknowledgement. Then it lifted its head again and looked past me, down the corridor behind me, and its amber eyes focused on something that I couldn't see. I turned around. 2 figures in Section H maintenance coveralls had come up through a junction hatch 20 meters back and were moving fast in my direction, carrying something between them in a containment unit the size of a large trunk. They saw me at the same moment I saw them. They stopped. I raised my comm. Jas Corin, 2 individuals. Section H corridor 20 meters north of Checkpoint 4. Containment unit appears biological transport grade. They're in Section H maintenance coveralls, unscheduled. Response team is 90 seconds out, Jaskorin said. Hold your position. The two figures made a decision, the kind of panicked decision that people make when their plan collapses and they're trying to find the fastest way out. They dropped the containment unit, carefully, deliberately, which told me they were experienced enough not to damage what was inside, and split in opposite directions. One ran toward me. One ran toward the observation deck access arm at the end of the corridor. Toward the Vraith-Hounds. The one running toward me was larger, faster, and clearly making the calculation that getting past the human was easier than whatever the alternative was. He was probably right that I was physically slower than he was and less equipped for direct confrontation. He wasn't wrong about the physics. But he didn't account for the freight stack at Checkpoint 4 that I had been logging all night, and which I'd been noting created a narrow pinch point in the corridor that significantly reduced effective running width. I didn't block him. I stepped aside at exactly the right moment and let him commit to the full-speed trajectory through the pinch point, and then I put my foot out. He went down hard. I was on my knees with his wrists secured behind him in 4 seconds, standard restraint technique, the kind that relied on mechanical efficiency rather than physical dominance, the kind that had been drilled into me at the academy as the human answer to the question of how to physically manage someone significantly larger than yourself. He was swearing in a language I didn't know. I was breathing carefully. The one who had run toward the observation deck arm, and the Vraith-Hounds had stopped. He'd stopped because the largest Vraith-Hound was standing directly in front of him, in the middle of the corridor, and it was looking at him in a way that apparently removed any remaining interest he had in continuing to run. He put his hands up. The other 2 Vraith-Hounds had moved to flank positions, one each side of the corridor, amber eyes forward, not attacking, not threatening exactly, just occupying space in a way that made very clear that the space was occupied and that the remaining option was to hold still. The response team arrived in 82 seconds.